This year has taken a toll out of all of us, but no one has suffered more than my gut. I've tried 3 different probiotics, several different vitamins, and it was getting expensive and exhausting. But I think I found my new holy grail for better gut health.
You are not the only one. I think I can safely speak for Josh when I say our household could also benefit from improved gut health and overall nutrition. And that's why we are so excited to share Athletic Greens with our listeners.
We really are. Athletic Greens has changed the game for my daily vitamin routine. With 1 delicious scoop of Athletic Greens, I'm absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help me start my day right.
In the few weeks since I've started using Athletic Greens, I don't have the tummy issues I was constantly experiencing, I feel an improvement in my metabolism, and I haven't been craving junk food as much. The ability to add it to a smoothie, take it with almond milk, water, or juice makes it easier for all of us to enjoy it however we'd like.
That's so true. And I've actually replaced my morning caffeine with Athletic Greens. And no lies, I feel more energized than ever. And at less than $3 a day, that was less than I was already spending on coffee.
What I really appreciate about Athletic Greens is that they are giving back to the community. For every purchase, they make a donation to an organization helping to get nutritious foods to children in need, including No Kid Hungry. They donated 1.2 million meals to children in need in 2020.
It's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition, especially as we're heading into flu and cold season. It's just 1 scoop every day. That's it. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health.
To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/rain.
Again, that's athleticgreens.com/rain to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance.
It's a new year, and that means it's time to say hello and thank you to our newest Patreon members, including Rachel L. from St. Peters, Missouri,
Kirsten S. from Milwaukee, Oregon,
Deanna C. in St. Louis Park, Minnesota,
and Melanie M. from Vancouver, Washington.
Thank you all so much for your support. It means so much to us, and we hope you enjoy all of your bonus episodes and extra bloopers and having your names said out loud by our beautiful, sexy voices. And if you want your name said by our voices or even Josh's, you can join our Patreon by searching Murder in the Rain at patreon.com.
I'm Emily Rowney.
And I'm Alicia Holland.
This is Bill Camp, the voice of Forensic Files 2 on HLN, and you're listening to Murder in the Rain.
In 1974, Cletus Bowles was serving concurrent state and federal sentences at Oregon State Penitentiary. He, alongside Wilfred Gray, had gone on a 4-day multi-state crime spree in 1965, robbing a motel and raping the desk clerk, committing a brazen midday bank robbery in Portland, Oregon, killing a sheriff's deputy in Eugene, kidnapping multiple families, and fleeing from authorities through Oregon, California, and Nevada. Both men were sentenced to life in prison and were never to be considered for parole. Gray pleaded guilty for the part he played in their crimes and was sent to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas, with a potential parole date in 2040. Wilfred Marion Gray died in prison September 21st, 2004. If you haven't already listened, you can hear that story in last week's episode, Catching Cletus Part 1, and you should, as I think it helps highlight many of Carl Bowles' red flags, which should have been noticed by prison officials and staff and could have prevented the man from acting out a sequel of sorts to his 1965 crimes. On March 9, 1968, 700 inmates took control of the Oregon State Penitentiary, infiltrating cell blocks, the kitchen, hospital, and other units. Fires were set, 40 hostages were taken, only 1 shot was fired, and after 15 hours, negotiations brought the incident to an end. The riot occurred after years of declining conditions and 3 inmate suicides over a 1-month period. The prisoners had a list of demands: an expanded work release program, better medical care, and the replacement of the current warden. Some inmates blamed the riot additionally on their frustration towards the red line system, which forced them to walk single file along a painted stripe on the floor. Those demands were agreed to minutes before a tactical assault on the inmates was to take place, which had been authorized by then-Governor Tom McCall. And that's when Hoyt Cupp strolled in. He had been the deputy superintendent of the Oregon State Correctional Facility, a newly constructed prison built to combat population strain at the penitentiary since 1958. He was named superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary, replacing 73-year-old warden Clarence Gladden, who was already planning to retire due to a cancer diagnosis. They really snuck one past the inmates with that one.
So earlier you mentioned the prisoners having an issue with redlining, and I wonder what their issue was. Like, what was the problem with walking along that line?
I believe it was that it was dehumanizing, that they had to they couldn't mill about, they couldn't walk. They
were forced to do something in a certain way.
Yeah, any movement between cell blocks and, administration buildings, medical units, they were walking down a stripe, which...
It was like kindergarten level, and they probably weren't very cool about anyone stepping out of line, even accidentally.
It's a little military, too, and I wonder if the prison at the time was following, like, military standards.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think the old warden, Gladden, was way more strict, more of a dictator. And under his reign, the prison was like falling apart. There were rats. The concrete was like falling apart. There was mold. I mean, it was just awful.
To be honest, their requirements or their requests were not crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they're reasonable requests.
Yeah, they're like 2 steps away from me. Like, can we have a bed and a toilet?
And blankets and pillows. Medical...
That's not
reasonable.
Yeah.
Cleanliness, reasonable. No rats? Nah. Live with them. Just kidding.
Less cockroaches? Can we just get less cockroaches?
Hoyt Carl Cupp was born in 1927 and raised in Salem, Oregon, graduating from Salem High School. Hired because his uncle ran the nearby prison farm, he began his career as a guard in 1948, the youngest ever hired at the prison. He graduated from the School of Correctional Administration at George Washington University in 1956 and earned his bachelor's degree from Western Oregon State College in 1977. He served on the Navy cruiser Springfield in the South Pacific during World War II and back at home committed to serving his community. He was on the boards of the Salem YMCA, the Salvation Army, Campfire Girls, and the Salem Boys Club. He even hosted talks about judo at his local YWCA. At one time, he was the president of the American Cancer Society in Salem and was a longtime member of the Quiet Birdman, a national pilots organization, as well as being a decorated marksman. The day after the 1968 riot, freshly minted Superintendent Cupp walked the prison's dining room as the inmates ate. Quote, "In my own way, I had to let them know I was running the place. And not just by being big and domineering. You have to have good discipline. You can't let people know you're fearful." Unquote. Cupp was a workaholic who often ate with inmates and chatted with them in the yard. He also encouraged expansion of the prison's recreational and educational programs. One of these improvements included the construction of an 18-hole mini golf course, and at one point there were even peacocks walking the grounds.
Wow. Fancy.
Cupp had a set of principles that became the state system's unofficial rules. Serve hearty food. Keep the institution clean. Don't lie to an inmate. Promote communication between inmates and officers. Provide prisoners with work, education, and recreation to limit their idle time. Offer rehabilitation programs to all inmates desiring change. Treat inmates with respect and expect them to follow suit. At Oregon State Penitentiary, Carl Cletus Bowles seemed to have changed his ways. He openly expressed remorse for his crimes, and his desire to reform from his criminal behavior seemed evident as he expressed interest in getting an education. His charm, good looks, and smaller stature eased prison staff, which I am sure he knew and took advantage of. Superintendent Hoyt Cupp was one who fell under the charm of Carl Cletus, so much so that he became an advocate for Bowles' rehabilitation. Bowles was lucky enough to have found himself a fiancée while behind bars. Actually, it was more so that she found him. She may have just been a lonely person looking for love, or perhaps they shared some connection, both of them being from Texas. But however the connection was made, Joan Coberly, 24, had been writing letters to Bowles, and their relationship grew through their correspondence. Eventually, she came to visit him in person. over a dozen times between August 1973 and May of 1974. And at some point, Bowles confessed to Superintendent Cupp that Joan was set to become his wife. Miss Coberly also spoke with Superintendent Cupp several times during her visits and was known to him as, quote, a responsible, concerned type of individual, with whom he saw a positive, nurturing relationship and connection to the outside world, which he believed was crucial to inmate rehabilitation. Another of Cupp's reforms, and one I imagine was pretty popular among inmates, was a conjugal visit program. Designed to maintain connections to loved ones in society at large, it had shown positive results after being tested in a number of prisons and was implemented as a statewide honor system in 1968, the year Cupp became superintendent. Most of the participating institutions provided lodging, such as trailers or simple cabins, for the conjugal program. Oregon State Penitentiary, however, had no such accommodations. So inmates were allowed to leave the prison to visit with their partners in their homes.
Oh boy.
Always supervised by correction employees and officers. Bowles submitted his first request for a conjugal visit on February 17th, receiving a 4-hour pass, which had never been issued to someone with a record of kidnapping and cop killing. He left and returned from the visit with no issues, visiting with Joan, who had taken up residence at a, or maybe the, Motel 6 in Salem, so as to remain close to her betrothed. 3 months later, Carl Cletus requested a 36-hour pass for May 17th. The request was denied, and he instead accepted another 4-hour pass. On May 17th, at 8:15 p.m., Bowles was escorted by a prison counselor, also a karate expert, to the Motel 6. He was dressed prison transport casual, meaning he wasn't clad in any kind of shackle, neither handcuffs nor leg irons.
So he was not shackled whatsoever. Was he even in a police vehicle for this transport, or is he just sitting next to his buddy, the karate cop, heading to his girlfriend's house?
Karate cop.
He's like, Cletus, throw a cassette in. Let's get crazy. Free bird, baby.
Get your motor running.
Bowles and the counselor walked up to room 30, where Carl was greeted by Joan Coberly. They were then left unsupervised, with the counselor waiting in the motel's parking lot in his vehicle, though he made sure his spot had a good view of the room door. Finally alone, when Carl Cletus entered the motel room and shut the door behind him, his first question to Joan was, "Did you bring a gun?" At 11 p.m., the counselor knocked at the door. The social pass was good from 8 p.m. to midnight, so it was time for he and Bowles to head back to the penitentiary. There was no answer. He knocked again, then ran to get the manager, who opened the door. They found the room empty. The bed had not been used, nor the shower. The room had a rear door, which the guard knew to be alarmed, but then learned from the manager that it was never activated until after midnight. Carl Cletus and Joan had a 3-hour head start on them. The couple had fled in Joan's '62 Ford Thunderbird, and there was no sighting of them or the car for 6 days. That was when it was found abandoned on the Reed College campus in southeast Portland, nearly 50 miles north of Salem. On the day Bowles escaped, Hoyt Cupp was in Arkansas, overseeing the Western Wardens Association meeting, where he received a phone call from the governor of Oregon, who informed him of Bowles' flight, then fined him $1,000 and suspended him for 14 days. This light punishment was determined after weighing Cupp's esteemed career, but the governor also warned that Cupp would have to resign if Bowles committed any acts of violence while on the loose. It was later found that a message regarding Bowles' imminent escape was never seen by Cupp and never entered into Bowles' file. The message had been sent by teletype to the Oregon State Penitentiary in September of 1973 by an Amarillo, Texas detective named Jimmy Stevens, who I found no other mention of, and I think the brevity of his time in this story adds an air of mystery to the man. Who is Jimmy Stevens? Anyway, the message warned that Joan was planning to help Bowles escape, which would have been nice to know yesterday. And side note, a teletype is a printing device that resembles a typewriter and is used to send and receive telephonic signals, which it translates to typed out text on little pieces of paper. The pair had disappeared and continued to hide from authorities for a month. On Friday, June 8th, Oregon Governor Tom McCall issued a statement which was then broadcast by West Coast radio stations, in which he pleaded with Bowles to surrender, funnily enough, to save Superintendent Cupp's career. He also guaranteed Bowles' safety if he would turn himself in. This message fell on deaf ears with Carl Cletus, but Joan was weary, and to her it may have sounded like a lifeline. On June 13th, in Eugene, Joan showed her identification to buy beer at a neighborhood market. The clerk, recognizing her from the news bulletins and television broadcasts, followed her briefly before breaking away and calling the cops, who responded quickly, establishing a perimeter around the area of her sighting. At 8 a.m. the next day, Friday, June 14th, Bowles left the apartment they were hiding out in to take a walk. At 33rd Avenue and South Willamette Street, he was approached by 2 federal agents who asked him for identification. His appearance, quote, vaguely reminded them of the description of Bowles that had been blasted across the radio, television, and newspapers for the previous month. Instead of a wallet, Carl Cletus waited until the agents closed most of the distance between them, then pulled out a pistol and began firing. A, quote, extensive gunfight ensued, and in the chaos, it was reported that one agent dropped his firearm, which Bowles somehow managed to snag before fleeing the scene. A house-to-house search began. Joan Coberly was quickly discovered and arrested without incident, but Carl Cletus somehow slipped out of Eugene and vanished for 2 days. After her arrest, Joan's lawyer, Donald B. Bowerman, said, quote, I believe she wanted to get caught. Joan Coberly was born in Lubbock, Texas, like Bowles. At 13, she ran away from home, afterward living with foster parents, and graduating from high school in 1969.
Nice.
Thank you. For 3 years, she then worked as a bank accountant in Oklahoma City before moving to Monrovia in Southern California and taking work as an assistant bookkeeper in Pasadena. At some point, she and Bowles began communicating through letters, eventually meeting in person and plotting his escape. While performing a background check as part of the investigation, police discovered that Joan was not Carl Cletus's fiancée, but in fact, his niece.
What? I'm glad they didn't do that conjugal visit.
It was never mentioned in any way if there was a sexual relationship between the two. I think it was more of a ruse for the escape. But his name is Cletus.
Hey, now. Let's not be judgy.
Did they know each other from being in Texas and being family? And they just faked, oh, look, I found you and I wrote a letter and now we're escaped lovers? Or had she tracked him down and found out he was her uncle?
Yeah, from detail in the Anne Rule story that I read that was called The Conjugal Visit, I think in her book Empty Promises, they talked about Joan knowing Carl and also kind of looking up to him as a hero. And I think she was sort of just...
So they had already known each other.
Yes, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and then she just kind of became, I think, enraptured by the idea of that sort of outlaw lifestyle.
And I'll have you know the name Cletus is derived from Greek. It's just not as popular as some of the other counterparts. But there was a pope named Anacletus. Just saying.
Questioned by investigators, Joan admitted to her participation from the start. After speeding away from the Motel 6 and ditching her car in Portland, she and Bowles stayed overnight with friends of his, who then drove the wanted duo to Eugene, where they hid at a commune, which was discovered to actually be more of a stark concrete bunker. After bunkering down for 10 to 12 days, they moved to an apartment in Eugene on or around May 28th. This apartment, located on Eugene's South Willamette Street, belonged to a widow who was away temporarily and had no idea her place was being used to harbor fugitives. The men who transported them to Eugene were arrested at some point along the line. The charges against one of the men ended up being dropped. The other was prosecuted, and he served time for harboring Bowles and Coberly. Joan served a 3-year term in the Oregon Women's Correctional Institution for hindering prosecution in Bowles' escape. According to her lawyer, she and her husband in California reconciled their definitely secure and enduring marriage. Bowles, who had disappeared after firing on federal agents in Eugene, next appeared on Sunday, June 16th, in Kingston, Idaho, 500 miles from Eugene, where he proceeded to camperjack a couple in their 60s, named Louisa and Joseph Jacob, who were parked on the side of the road, just like the Reekstons family from part 1 of this story. Brandishing a gun, he told them to drive him to Coeur d'Alene, which was about a 40-minute drive west. As they approached the city of nearly 45,000 residents, Joseph Jacob, who was driving, threw a punch at Bowles, striking him in the eye, shouting, quote, "I've had enough of this foolishness. Either kill me or get the hell out." Carl Cletus, who was accustomed to being in control when he had a gun in his hand, was, quote, flabbergasted and, quote, almost meekly alighted from the camper. Back on the road and desperate for transport, Cletus then stopped a car containing 2 men, forcing them to drive him. They only went a few miles before one of the men told Bowles to keep the car and let them out, which he did. An ambulance driver who witnessed Bowles carjacking the 2 men radioed the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office, which began a pursuit of the fugitive. After only a mile and a half of driving, the car carrying Bowles crashed into a utility pole, wrecking it. Carl Cletus ran from the sound of approaching sirens, using his gun to stop a man on a motorcycle, climbing on the bike behind him and making him speed off. 43 miles later, as Bowles and his new hostage entered Post Falls, Idaho, the motorcycle overturned. Carl Cletus was relatively unharmed from the bike dumping over, and he fled, as was his custom. He soon reached the bank of the Spokane River and began wading into the chilly water. Police Sergeant Jim Guy, who was in pursuit of Bowles, stopped at the water's edge and ordered the man, who was in it up to his knees, literally and metaphorically, to freeze. Bowles spun around. Sergeant Gray spotted the pistol in his hand and was able to get a shot off first. Carl Cletus was hit in the abdomen, which dropped him where he stood. Police dragged him from the water, placing him under arrest and transporting him to the Kootenai Memorial Hospital in Coeur d'Alene, where he underwent 5.5 hours of surgery to repair his colon.
The intensity of his desperation at this point, of like camper to motorcycle, which I've never heard of in my life, of a motorcycle getting...
No. Yeah, he got on and rode behind him.
Yeah, and is like, I'm riding bitch,
like
but you're my bitch.
Cute couple.
And
that
then,
would be pretty funny to see.
And just crashing on a motorcycle and just getting up and going.
You know, it'd be better if it had a sidecar.
Oh my God.
He's in the sidecar holding a gun.
Now, do you have any goggles for me to wear? It's very windy. And then like in a river, it's just the intensity and the mania. My goodness.
Bowles survived the surgery on his bowels. Sometime after, while recuperating, Superintendent Hoyt Cupp, who had traveled from Oregon, attended Bowles' hospital bedside, where he pleaded with Bowles for information regarding a missing couple, Viola and Earl Hunter, both in their 60s. The old friends, finally reunited, spoke for 2.5 hours.
If you're like Emily, you're probably always on the lookout for a new podcast. And lucky for you, the latest season of the wildly popular con-themed podcast Chameleon is back.
In season 1, they talked about the Hollywood Con Queen, a scam targeting up-and-coming hopefuls in Hollywood's film industry. It was great. I was hooked on every word.
Season 2, High Rollers, tracked the story of an FBI sting operation gone wrong.
This new season is called Wild Boys, and it covers the 2003 international news story where 2 half-starved young boys wandered from the wilderness into a small Canadian town. They become known as the Bush Boys, and they tell this incredible story about being raised in the British Columbia wilderness. In fact, they tell the town that it was their first ever contact with society. They'd never seen a TV, gone to school, used a cell phone, or registered for an ID.
There was just one problem. Not a single word the boys were saying was true. Nearly 20 years later, award-winning comedian and journalist Sam Mullins uncovers the bizarre true story of the strangers who turned his hometown upside down. It's a psychological drama you can't miss, with never-before-heard interviews and audio from the boys and their family.
I cannot wait to dig into this one. I love a good scandal.
Who doesn't? To hear the story, search for Chameleon Wild Boys on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening now.
Back on June 14th in Eugene, Earl Hunter, a railroad freight office executive, called his wife Viola after hearing about the police activity and shootout in South Eugene. Viola was upset, as she had also heard about the gunfight and wanted Earl to come home early, so he gathered his things and left for the day. On Monday, June 16th, police had been notified that the Hunters had not been seen since the 14th, the day Bowles escaped the police dragnet and house-to-house search in Eugene. Police checked the Hunters' house and found that 3 of the home's 4 beds had been slept in. This led them to believe Bowles might have had a forced slumber party with the Hunters. I believe back then it was a little more common for couples to share separate beds, so 2 beds for Earl and Viola Hunter, and 1 for Bowles. It seemed Bowles had used the Hunters just as he and Wilfred Gray had done to the Corbin, Reekstons, and Champion families during their spree in 1965, cloaking himself, the wolf, under their traveling sheep's wool. Bowles eventually admitted that yes, while fleeing on foot from his gunfight with federal agents, he'd wound up in the Hunter's backyard. There he found Viola Hunter on the back porch, and with 2 pistols trained in her direction, forced her inside to wait for Earl to return home. He then used the married couple in their 1971 tan over beige Chevy coupe to slip through the police perimeter unnoticed. Bowles repeated to Cupp over and over that he had released the Hunters unharmed in Yakima, Washington, as a convenience because the Hunters told him they had friends there. Bowles said he then hitchhiked to Coeur d'Alene, where he was shot and captured, but Hoyt Cupp felt he was lying. The Hunter's son also appealed to Bowles for information, but made no headway, with Carl Cletus saying, quote, "I didn't harm your people. I only shot one man in my life," unquote. That man being Deputy Carlton E. Smith in Eugene in 1965. On June 21st, the Hunter's car was found on a residential street in Spokane, Washington, 3 hours from Yakima. It had been there a week, but in that time, none of the nearby homeowners had seen anyone in or around the car. FBI agents examined the vehicle, finding no signs of violence and no indication as to the Hunter's location. At Oregon State Penitentiary, prison inmates started a memorial fund for the Hunter family. They quickly raised $400, donating from their 25-cent per day pay, with a prison official commenting that, quote, "This is their way of showing that not everyone inside the prison is the Bowles type," unquote. The persistent questioning finally paid off. To no benefit of his own, Carl Cletus Bowles confessed to killing Viola and Earl Hunter. It was never known why he killed them. He never gave a reason. But I believe a life of further incarceration and the fact that he was never to be released had emptied him to a husk with even less respect for human life than he had the first time he'd killed, pumping rounds into Deputy Smith and leaving him for dead. Even without the couple or their bodies, on June 27, 1974, Bowles pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, receiving a 75-year sentence for the killings of Viola and Earl Hunter. This was done in a conference room in the Kootenai Memorial Hospital, where Bowles was recovering, which had been set up for a special court session. After fully recuperating from his brush with death, Carl Cletus was transferred to Idaho State Penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. On July 11th, a rancher discovered 2 badly decomposed bodies in a ditch in a willow thicket on a wheat ranch 25 miles from Spokane, Washington. Through dental records and personal items like jewelry on the bodies, they were identified as the Hunters. Their bodies were found lying face down. Earl had been shot in the chest and head. Viola's cause of death was indeterminate due to her body's level of decomposition, though lead fragments were discovered on its shattered facial bones during the coroner's examination. The rancher who found the bodies was offered the $1,000 reward put up by the Hunter's son-in-law, but he refused the money, saying, quote, "The family certainly needs it. Their loss is much greater than that money would be for me," unquote. After the discovery of the Hunters' bodies, federal charges brought against Bowles resulted in him receiving 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. Investigating Bowles' background, authorities found that his introduction to prison life came at age 13, after his parents placed him in the Texas Correctional Institute, a boys' reformatory facility. They had done this in reaction to Carl Cletus acting out after they had begun divorce proceedings. He was released a year later to his parents, who had somehow remained together, and was quickly returned to the institute, as his behavior had not improved. He spent the next 2 years there, before being released and then arrested again within 2 weeks for car theft and interstate transport of a vehicle. A life in and out of incarceration encouraged his criminal side, which is reflected, I believe, in the fact that his crimes only ramped up in seriousness over time. It seems Carl's parents birthed him, but prison had made him. Sentencing Judge William J. Grant, before administering Bowles' sentence, said, quote, "There should be 2 other people here today, but can't. The Hunters. Words cannot tell the seriousness of these crimes. Call them cold-blooded, vicious if you will. You should be separated from society for as long a time as possible," unquote. Carl Cletus Bowles spent the rest of his life 7 floors underground in a federal prison. He died there on April 27, 2005. Deputy Carlton E. Smith's son said in a 2006 Eugene Register Guard article, after learning that both of his father's killers had died behind bars, quote, "I wasn't jumping up and down with joy that they died. I probably have some peace of mind knowing that neither of them will ever be outside prison walls where they can hurt someone else." Currently, only 4 states allow conjugal visits: California, Connecticut, New York, and Washington. Quote, "The Federal Bureau of Prisons does not allow conjugal visits for prisoners in federal custody," unquote. On November 23rd, 1991, at a seminar named Criminal Justice in Oregon, Portland State University professor of Administration of Justice Gary Perlstein was given a Hoyt C. Cup Award for, quote, significant and lasting contributions to the corrections field, named for Hoyt Cup, who had a reputation for getting inmates involved in community service. Cup was superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary for 17 years, from 1968 to 1985, making him the longest-serving superintendent of a maximum security prison in U.S. history, and he nearly lost that career in the wake of Carl Cletus Bowles' escape. Maybe he should have. While Bowles was still at large, Governor Tom McCall had promised that if anyone were hurt during his evasion of authorities, Cup would be forced to resign. That never came to pass for some reason, maybe because the hunters were murdered out of state? Either way, he continued working in the Oregon prison system for a total of 37 years, retiring January 1st, 1986.
I have to imagine he learned a lesson from that, not to be duped by prisoners who might be charismatic and good-looking.
Or if you're going to provide certain things, they still have to be secure and not just at a Motel 6.
There was an article, I think that was published a year or two after this incident, all of, Bowles' escape, and some information came out saying that Superintendent Cup hadn't sought the advice of a team of people that did that sort of examination to determine whether or not people could have a conjugal visit.
Like who was...
Yeah, they evaluated.
No one was vetted for being not
eligible.
A flight risk.
They normally were. Carl Bowles was not.
But they were saying he was under his spell.
Hoyt Cup described himself growing up as a, quote, fatherless street kid, secretly yearning for guidance and structure. He believed that childhood desire filtered down into his career, caring for cell blocks of men, once kids, who may have once run as free as Cup had. Hoyt Cup died October 8th, 1990. In Portland at age 63. The inscription on his headstone reads, "A man who cared." That's the end of the story, and I have a couple of quick postscripts here that didn't really fit into the story. An NBCnews.com article from October 19th detailed the 5-year efforts to, quote, spur a cultural shift not only at the penitentiary, but also in other correctional facilities across the country, by helping create a sense of normalcy inside the facility, unquote. This was being done in the form of a Japanese garden, built on the grounds of Oregon State Penitentiary by the Asian Pacific Family Club, consisting of those in custody at the prison, who were tasked with fundraising for the entire venture. They achieved this, raising nearly $300,000 by partnering with churches and universities, community fundraising and grants, even receiving donations from local farms. One man, Johnny Kofer, said, quote, the day the trees came in, I hadn't touched a tree in almost 20 years. The experience was very emotional, to say the least. There's no Google Maps to restoration and redemption. You have to forge your own way. I think that even though I may not be forgiven for the harms that I've caused, maybe some people will be impacted in a positive way as a result of my choices today and tomorrow. And the second postscript. Hale Champion, who was one of many people taken hostage during Bowles' 1965 crime spree, gave a statement at a Federal Firearms Act hearing later that same year. Senator Thomas J. Dodd, speaking with Champion, referred to the many previous witnesses at the hearing who stated there was no real evidence that long guns, shotguns and rifles, were commonly used by criminals. Hale replied, quote, one was held to my head for something like 20 minutes, so I can testify that at least once it was so used, unquote.
Ooh. I would have said that more snarkily.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
When speaking of those opposed to stricter regulations on firearms, Champion also said, quote, these people will admit the necessity of some reform, but only in degree. They continue to feel that new regulations ought not to impose any more than a minimal burden of time and inconvenience on the would-be legitimate purchaser or user of a firearm. No matter how much additional regulations which would impose such burdens of time and inconvenience might help to solve the firearms control problems of society as a whole, I would urge that the attitude be reversed. They ought to be willing to accept relatively heavy burdens so long as their basic privilege is still available. Unquote. A champion indeed.
That's cool that he was able to take that experience and try to make things better. Reminds me of David Hogg from the high school shooting a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Just taking that voice and that experience to say, oh, you don't think that's used for that? Well,
Yeah, especially when it's so easy to just move on in your life and try to
Mhm.
not think about it, but using that painful experience to try to make things better for others.
And I like that point too of like you should want more regulation, like you should want to have that burden.
It's like if they accepted that, they would probably be able to have all the guns they wanted
Mhm.
if they just locked them up,
Yeah.
registered them legally, and maybe didn't have a million, maybe. Anyways,
I can't decide how I feel about Hoyt.
I think he had the best intentions.
It's like, is there blame? Is how much blame, I suppose, is there because he was the one that permitted this guy to basically be free? But it's also, it's Cletus's choices and actions. But
Yeah, it's like you expect them to know better in that position. You've
Mhm.
met a million criminals. You should know better.
right,
But at the same time, he was a compassionate person
right.
and he made a mistake.
And we've talked about that where the burden of the parole board or whoever, and it's like you're taking that gamble and you're hoping it doesn't result in anyone losing their lives.
Right,
And then
like-
in this case,
It's an
the
educated
hunters-
guess / your gut, and maybe his gut was just wrong because
Yeah.
this guy clearly had a way about him.
Yeah.
He spent his entire life as a criminal.
oh, yeah, he was institutionalized. He knew how to get what he wanted.
And then
from
I
who
feel
he
kind of
needed
bad
it.
for him too. It's like he had no chance
Yeah.
to be anything other than a deviant.
Yeah, you get shipped off at 13. It's like, oh, okay, I'll just learn how to survive this system.
And
now.
that's what he was good at. That's what he knew.
Yeah. And Josh, this case actually came up because it was connected to my Richard Marquette case from a few episodes ago.
Right.
Because these two guys, Marquette and Bowles, were kind of the poster children for other people that were coming up for parole. And there were articles that I read where people were like, I am so close to getting paroled. And now everyone is so scared
They
that they aren't
ruined
going to
it.
get let out because these
Mhm.
two guys were given an inch and they took miles.
Right.
And so there was frustration from the people that had given the levity, and then frustration within the prison system of like, these two guys ruined it for everyone.
That's hard because you can't always judge someone by someone else's actions, right?
Exactly.
It's like everyone's an individual. They carry themselves differently in every scenario, but it's really hard not to in a
Mhm.
prison scenario.
Or like, if you're the Oregon State Penitentiary, you don't want to be like, well, we'll let more people out and we'll just keep seeing if they reoffend when you've got two people who murdered people when they were out, which sucks so much because the argument is always just like rehabilitation and better conditions,
But
not
there's always going to be someone who
Yeah.
sneaks out. I mean, look at how many escapees we've had in
Mhm.
this state.
yeah.
Yeah, I think Cup was definitely responsible for a lot of that and should have definitely incurred more
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
a punishment.
But then again, was it just him? Like, isn't there a board of people who should be on this
Right.
decision?
Well, I think he bypassed all of that. He
Mm.
kind of took him under his wing as his like special project, I believe. And I think too, or I had this thought while I was researching it, is that I think sometimes people with like great intentions do good things, and because they're doing something good, they assume that the person that's
Yes.
responding to it are
Yeah.
going to be
he
equals.
thinks it's a two-sided
and
relationship,
it's
and
yeah.
it was one.
So it was more from a place of naivete than like ego.
And maybe also from a place of being in prisons for like 20 years before
Yeah.
that, thinking that he knew everything when in
Right,
fact,
and this guy showed him something maybe he'd never seen in a prisoner before.
Yeah.
yeah, like someone he's like, oh, I bet he could be the warden someday.
Yeah.
Or just like
Yeah.
this guy could be the poster child for reform, and like, look, he's attractive and he's nice and he's learned his lesson.
I know I've been in that position, obviously in a totally different realm, but you get those students that no one else can work with and they won't do any work and they won't sit in class or whatever. And you kind of like, if you end up having one of those kids bond with you, you do kind of get this sense of like
I did it.
purpose or like, yeah, or like, I can do, this is my job, this is my purpose, I can do this with this kid. And then it's like, oh my God, look, they're doing it. And then like you try to show off to someone and then they get like a black eye because the kid was like only decent to you because you had that bond and that didn't translate to everything. So I can see where that could happen, where it's just the charm and the connection. These two guys were maybe really connected on some level, but it just
I
didn't
think he was
translate.
being duped. I don't think it was two-sided. I think he
Yeah.
fell under the charm. What did you say? Svengali, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
is a-
Svengali. Yeah,
that is a
yeah.
perfect description of it. That the prisoner had all the control and
Yeah.
and the other guy didn't even know it. He
Yeah.
didn't see it at all.
Yeah. That's interesting and heartbreaking, too. You don't think about trees at prison.
Oh, that was sad. I had a little tear.
Yeah, like you don't think about it because you're like, oh, outside. And it's like, no, it's the yard, but it's no yard. Like,
well, and we've had plenty of listeners reach out, and I think we were criticized once for, it was an episode of particularly harsh subject where it is hard to see that someone is a human with some of the stuff they did. But it's true. Like, these are people, these are humans, and just because they screwed up royally doesn't mean they should be treated like animals or worse than animals.
And what good or benefit, like, not having access to even a tree? Is that going to keep
for
them,
your mental health?
Yeah, is that going to rehabilitate them? Is that going to make them be like, okay, I won't rob a store next time because I want to see a tree? It's like,
we constantly see prisons who do well because they have programs where people are outdoors or their work release or they have more freedoms than other prisons. So I don't think there's anything wrong with letting them have outside time.
Right. And I think there's a balance because, you always see like, I think it's Sweden or something. The pictures of the prisons go around because they have like one prison because it's Sweden.
It looks like a school.
Yeah, it looks like a school and it looks like a, country club getaway. Which is really which is really nice, but it's also like, what is that balance? I don't know the answer. What is the balance of rehabilitation versus punishment and making it an alluring thing?
I think it's both, right? You're there to be punished, but you're there to learn a lesson and try to become a better person.
Yeah, it should be like, we need to cure you of,
and you're not going to do that by keeping them underground in a cement prison with no window.
You get Carl Cletus that way.
Exactly. So I think there is a balance that nobody's gotten just right.
Yeah.
Which should have been noticed by prison.
Prison. Sorry, we just want to loosen you up.
Thank you. I feel very loose now.
Oh.
Sorry.
Butt cheeks flapping in the wind loose.
Yeah, when I twerk, it sounds like dusting out an old rug or something.
2 eggs and a hanky.
That's right. Big old hanky.
Dearest Cletus, late at night I dream of you. But if you think about it in like Greek history, Cletus sounds a little different in my head.
Yeah, I mean, I blame The Simpsons
Probably
for that slack-jawed yokel.
Our friend Chris,
I always forget the name of it. It's one word, right?
3. Super uptight Christian family, like can't even watch Star Wars, and they went to the theater to watch Rules of Attraction.
That's right. That's right.
Oh my!
Yeah.
I like too that there's a whole scene where we watch him like take a shit in real time.
Yeah.
That's fun. He was dressed prison
again.
Excuse me, guys. I'm sorry.
We're going back to prison.
I'm not as accustomed to this as you are. I don't say prison is awful. Awful. Fuck.
I'm sorry that we make fun of you. It's just, we can't help it.
We have to. I do it to you guys.
Also, we hate men.
Yeah.
That's true.
You have a penis. Sorry.
I know.
We have to mock you.
I'm sorry about it too.
You.
My little pee-pee. Grab it with a tweezer and laugh at it.
With your flappy butt.
That butt flapping in the air like that big ass flag at Camping World.
Oh my God.
Murder in the Rain is produced and edited by Josh McCullough. Written and hosted by Emily Rowney and Alicia Holland. Artwork by Jamie Costa. Music by Kai Pfeiffer at kyfifer.com. Check out our website, murderintherain.com, for additional information on all cases, a fun interactive map, and be sure to subscribe so you can receive our newsletter. Check out the Mad Props page for coupon codes from some of our sponsors. We love your reviews and seeing them on all streaming platforms, especially iTunes. And check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And suck my balls.
Please put that in.